It was a night that promised to be like any other. The stage was set at one of the most watched talk shows in the nation, the Truth Unfiltered. The lights were dim, casting a theatrical glow across the room, the audience eagerly awaiting the latest episode. The guest of honor? None other than Melania Trump, former First Lady of the United States. Melania stepped onto the stage, the sound of the applause filling the room, but her presence commanded an almost eerie silence. Dressed in a sleek, royal blue dress, the audience was struck by her calm yet unyielding poise. Her long brown hair cascaded in waves, and her makeup was flawless. As she gracefully took her seat across from Gregory Turner, the talk show host, the air in the studio seemed to grow heavier with anticipation. Gregory Turner, with his usual sharp suit and polished smile, leaned forward, clearly ready to dive into his calculated questioning. He had made a career dismantling the reputations of powerful figures, and tonight, he believed, would be no different. His smirk never wavered as he addressed Melania. "Welcome, Melania," he said smoothly, his voice laced with an almost mocking politeness. "It's not every day we have someone of your stature here, especially after such a controversial tenure in the White House. Let's start with the obvious question. How do you feel about the way the media has portrayed you over the years? The silent First Lady, the distant wife. Are these labels fair?" The studio audience held its breath, awaiting her reaction. Melania, however, remained completely unfazed. She met Gregory's question with an unwavering gaze, her posture still, dignified. Her lips parted slightly before she spoke, her voice calm but with an underlying firmness. "Gregory, I believe it's easy for people to create narratives based on their own biases," Melania replied, her eyes never leaving his. "I have always tried to do my best to support my family and contribute to causes I truly believe in. Whether the media chooses to acknowledge that is entirely their choice." Gregory chuckled, his smirk widening, sensing an opening. "But Melania," he pressed, leaning forward with a dramatic pause, "you were often seen as more of a bystander in your husband's administration. People wondered if you had any real voice, any influence at all. Many even questioned your silence on major issues. Don't you think that leaves a lot to be desired? People expected more from you, the First Lady." Melania's eyes narrowed, but her composure remained impeccable. She had been in the public eye long enough to know how these questions worked, and she wasn't about to let Gregory off so easily. "People are entitled to their opinions," she said, her voice steady. "But I choose to act in a way that is true to myself. I didn't need to be loud or outspoken to have an impact. My actions, my work, my commitment to causes like children's health and well-being, those speak for themselves." Gregory's face twitched ever so slightly. He had expected Melania to be rattled, defensive, but instead she was poised, confident, even more unflinching with each word. But Gregory wasn't done yet. His next question would hit harder. "So, you're telling me that your legacy is defined by a few visits to hospitals or some initiatives you quietly endorsed?" Gregory's voice grew sharper, his words calculated to spark controversy. "Your husband was often criticized for his rhetoric, his divisiveness. Where did you stand? Did you ever challenge him on his policies, especially when it came to women's rights?" The audience shifted uneasily. The question was loaded, a direct attempt to undermine her position and make her respond in a way that would spark outrage. But once again, Melania responded without hesitation, her voice even and measured. "I stood by my principles," she said, the words cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "I believe in supporting those who are marginalized and voiceless. And I work hard to ensure that we address the needs of children, veterans, and those who need help the most. I don't need to shout to make a difference." For a brief moment, the entire room seemed to still. Gregory, who had been so confident in his ability to control the narrative, found himself at a loss for words. He had expected Melania to crack under the pressure, to falter, but she remained composed and unwavering. "Do you ever feel, Melania," Gregory continued, his voice now tinged with disbelief, "that the silence surrounding your actions only made things worse? that by not speaking out more, you may have alienated the very people you sought to help. Melania's gaze intensified. No, she said simply, each syllable deliberate. Silence is not the absence of action. Sometimes, silence is a space needed to reflect and understand before taking action. That is something I've always believed. The studio audience was silent now, the tension palpable. Melania had turned the tables, not with anger or defiance, but with clarity and truth. Gregory, who had expected to leave the stage victorious, found himself speechless. The silence between them stretched, growing heavy, as Melania's composure filled the room. Gregory opened his mouth, then closed it again. His usual quick wit failed him for the first time in years. He had no retort, no clever comeback. He was exposed, and the realization hit him hard. It was then that the truth dawned. Melania Trump, with her calm presence, her understated strength, had just shut him down. The audience, who had been waiting for her to stumble, now watched in awe as she turned the conversation back to a place of dignity and quiet authority. The interview continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Gregory, once the hunter, was now the hunted, and Melania, with her grace and poise, had proven that sometimes the most powerful responses come in silence. As the show wrapped up, the impact of the exchange lingered. Melania Trump had shown the world that strength doesn't need to shout. Sometimes, it's the quiet moments that speak the loudest. And Gregory Turner, the seasoned talk show host, would leave that night knowing he had been bested by the very thing he had underestimated: Melania's inner strength. Her silence spoke volumes. As Melania walked off the set, her mind was racing, but her exterior remained as calm and graceful as ever. The tension between her and Gregory had been palpable, but she had managed to hold her ground. The entire studio felt like it had shifted in that moment. No one had expected her to respond the way she had. She knew her words had struck deep, but she also understood the power of silence and the control it could give in such situations. Back in the green room, Melania sat in a quiet corner, her expression still composed but her mind in motion. The producer entered, looking almost as shocked as Gregory had moments before. "Mrs. Trump, I must admit, that was something I haven't seen in a long time," the producer said, his voice filled with awe. "Thank you," Melania replied softly, her eyes meeting his for a moment. "I just wanted to make sure that the conversation was about more than just sound bites." The producer nodded, clearly impressed by her poise. "You have the world talking now, Mrs. Trump. The interview will surely be the headline everywhere tomorrow. But, can I ask, how did you remain so calm?" She smiled, her gaze turning toward the distant city lights visible from the studio windows. "Calmness is a choice. When you know what you stand for, nothing can shake you." Meanwhile, Gregory was still processing the weight of the exchange. He had been the one in control, or so he had thought. Now, he felt exposed. His usual bravado and sharp comments had failed him when it mattered most. The applause from his studio audience had been muted, almost unsure, and for the first time in his career, he was left to reflect rather than dictate the narrative. The producers gathered around him, eager to get his take on what had just transpired. They were concerned. This wasn't the reaction they had expected from their primetime show. They were used to getting high ratings from confrontational moments, but this was different, and Gregory wasn't sure whether it was the kind of different he wanted. Gregory looked down at his hands for a moment before answering, the tension in his voice now evident. She knew exactly what she was doing," he muttered. "She didn't just sit there and take it. She turned the tables on me, and I wasn't prepared for it." The producers exchanged nervous glances. They had witnessed the shift, and they knew this interview would be remembered for a long time. But what would that mean for the future of the show? For Gregory's reputation? Meanwhile, Melania's composure had become the talk of the town. Social media was buzzing with opinions from both sides. Some were still reeling from the shock, while others were praising her for taking charge and exposing the flaw in the interview. In the hours following the show, The hashtag Melania turns the tables began to trend worldwide. News outlets couldn't stop talking about the interview. Some commentators were quick to label Melania's performance as a display of strength, while others questioned whether it had been calculated and politically motivated. Either way, the impact was undeniable. Gregory, on the other hand, was preparing for the aftermath. He knew that his network would expect him to address what had happened, to salvage his image, but he wasn't sure how. He had been outwitted, and that wasn't a position he was used to. It was clear now. This wasn't just another celebrity interview. Melania Trump had proven that she was more than just a political figure. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the world was watching. The morning after the interview, the media landscape had been transformed. What was supposed to be just another segment on a late-night talk show had become a seismic event. Melania Trump's calm yet powerful performance was on everyone's lips. News outlets were scrambling to dissect every second, analyzing her every word, her composure, and the silences that had left Gregory speechless. For Melania, the following days were filled with both admiration and criticism. While many hailed her for turning the tables and showing a side of strength and intellect that few had expected, others questioned her motivations. Some pundits argued that she had played her cards carefully, knowing exactly how to outmaneuver Gregory and steer the narrative away from his intended questions. But Melania, as always, remained unbothered by the noise. She had faced far worse storms in her life, and this, she knew, would pass. She wasn't one to seek the spotlight for the sake of it, but when it mattered, she knew how to stand firm. Back at the studio, Gregory had spent the last few days reflecting on the interview. He was not one to easily admit defeat, but it was clear that something had changed within him. For the first time, he questioned his approach to interviewing people. He had always prided himself on his ability to push guests to their limits, to force them into uncomfortable corners. But Melania had shown him that strength didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes, silence was louder than any words. The producers of his show had insisted that he make a statement about the interview. Gregory sat in front of the cameras, the pressure mounting on him. He cleared his throat, took a deep breath, and began. Last week's interview with Mrs. Trump was unexpected. It's not often that a guest leaves me speechless, but I must admit, she did. The conversation took a turn that I wasn't prepared for, but that's part of the game. We all have our moments where we think we're in control, only to find out that we're not. And Mrs. Trump, with her composure and quiet strength, taught me that lesson. The statement was honest, though not without its air of defensiveness. Gregory knew he couldn't fully admit to being outclassed, but the acknowledgement of her strength was a rare moment of vulnerability for someone as proud as him. As for Melania, life moved on. She continued her charitable work and engagements, but her presence loomed larger than before. People now saw her in a different light, one not just as the wife of a former president, but as a powerful figure in her own right. The interview had shown a side of her that many had underestimated. Weeks later, Melania was invited to another talk show, but this time, things were different. The host, aware of the media frenzy surrounding her, approached with a level of caution that had never been present before. He was respectful, acknowledging her previous interview and the impact it had had. But Melania, true to her nature, had no interest in further confrontation. She had made her point, and she knew that it was time for others to listen. "I'm here to talk about the causes I believe in," she said with a soft smile. "I don't need to prove myself. I just want to make a difference." And make a difference she did. The discussion shifted from politics to real, tangible issues, charitable causes, community efforts, and the importance of empathy and understanding. Once again, Melania managed to turn a potentially contentious interview into a platform for the issues she cared about. In the end, her appearance had transformed not only the way the media viewed her, but also the way the public saw her. No longer just a figurehead in the background, Melania Trump had taken control of her own narrative, showing that even in the most charged moments, grace, silence, and strength could speak volumes. As she left the studio that day, she knew that the world had seen her for who she truly was. Not as a political pawn, not as someone who needed validation, but as a woman who had found her voice and was not afraid to use it on her own terms.